We don't just offer carbon capture. We really offer the whole carbon management solution and sustainable CO2. It's a recycled, traceable product.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. For this episode, we are joined by Anna Pavlova, the Senior Vice President of Strategy, Market Development, and Sustainability at CarbonQuest, which is a company specializing in carbon capture solutions for buildings. Anna, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Typically on this podcast, we like to get to know our guests a little bit better and find out what they used to do before entering the carbon industry, and then what eventually inspired them to do so. So please do share with us what your background is and what it is you were up to before joining CarbonQuest.
Yeah, hello, Violet. I am very excited to be on the podcast. I am a huge fan of podcasts in general, so this is also personally fun for me. I've been in the energy transition and decarbonization space for most of my career at this point. I was an executive at larger companies, much larger companies, but they also focused primarily on decarbonization of industrials, buildings, and data centers. The last company I was at is a very large French company called Schneider Electric. Maybe not as well known to the general public, but very well known in the electrical, digital, and decarbonization space. Before that, I worked at another similar company, an American company called Johnson Controls, also focused on building industrial energy transition, energy efficiency. And I actually started my career mostly focused on policy and government relations. And that's how I ended up being in Washington, D.C. And then as my career progressed, my focus increased more so towards strategy and sustainability, especially as sustainability grew in importance for those companies, both internally and what they can provide to the clients. And strategy, I was in a strategy group at Schneider, and it was just a fascinating moment in time because corporate strategy and energy transition strategy, decarbonization strategy, all of a sudden merged to really become one and the same. You couldn't really separate innovation strategy for these companies from energy transition. And so when I came to CarbonQuest, this really became a natural transition for me to just focus on strategy and market development for CarbonQuest.
Thank you so much for sharing. Now, moving on to CarbonQuest, what you guys do is rather unique, and at least to my knowledge, there aren't a lot of companies out there offering decarbonization solutions specifically for buildings. So can you please give us a little more detail about what your business model is and how your technology works?
Yeah, we are pretty unique in the carbon capture space. We are the one distributed carbon capture company, meaning that we're really focused on medium-sized emitters, and perhaps emitters that one may not naturally think of when one thinks of carbon capture. A lot of times people assume carbon capture is only for oil and gas companies or maybe a steel company, but there are many, many, many other emitters, about 2.6 gigatons at least of emissions in the US that come from other types of emitters that may not have other solutions. And so that's a very wide space, of course. And we originally proved our concept by concentrating in large buildings. So not your homes, not your residential, but the bigger buildings. Our proof of concept to show that we could commercialize has been in 6 projects in Manhattan, in big, tall buildings in Manhattan. And the idea there was that we can, A, show that our technology works. We use toxin-free solid sorbents to attract CO2 molecules. So we needed to show that makes sense. And then we also wanted to show that we can fit into tight physical spaces, and where else better to practice that than Manhattan. And that our systems are modular and can be configured in different ways. And so we've really proved that out. And now we're focusing on what's next, both in bigger buildings, but also in campus settings. So schools, universities, hospitals that are larger settings with more complex heating systems in those buildings and facilities. And then also we have some other new things in kind of outside of the classical city building space.
And does CarbonQuest deal with residential buildings at all, or is that something in the works perhaps, or not something you guys focus on or plan on focusing on?
I think that if you're thinking of a traditional residential home, it makes sense for that home to electrify. I think that's where the electrification is easiest, especially new construction homes, but also retrofitting my house, for example, but that electrical heat pumps makes sense. Where it becomes difficult is more complex systems. So in Manhattan, we have residential buildings, but they have commercial boilers in that. They're very, very big buildings. And so they really are just like a commercial building. It's less important whether who lives there or if somebody works there. But the idea is that the bigger the building is, and especially if it's a group of buildings like a campus, and there's some resilience requirements, for example, really cannot lose power in a hospital, then you really want to keep that resilience. And then electrification becomes very difficult. And usually it's not just boilers, it's combined heat and power, reciprocal engines, fuel cells. And so those things need to be addressed and decarbonized, but very difficult to do with electrification. So we're focused primarily on that space and maybe stepping into utility infrastructure and manufacturing a little bit. Happy to talk about that as well.
Of course. Where else is CarbonQuest or CarbonQuest technology available outside of New York?
So we're a bi-coastal company, actually, and our headquarters are kind of in two places, New York and in Spokane, Washington. And there we are also focused on slightly different types of projects, a lot of utility infrastructure. But generally, we're now starting to expand across the US and a little bit in Canada, looking for projects where we can help decarbonize right away with our system. That usually right now, our focus is primarily in facilities or buildings where they have combined heat and power or fuel cells, or where additional power like data centers may be needed, and they want to put in one of those systems, and then we come in as a bolt-on feature. So it's fuel cell plus carbon capture, or combined heat and power plus carbon capture.
Excellent. Now that we've got kind of the capture side covered, I also really wanted to get into the utilization side of things, because capturing CO2 is one thing and it's a great thing, but there inevitably comes the question of what to do with it. And I know that CarbonQuest has a very intriguing solution for that as well, called sustainable CO2. Could you please tell us more about that?
Yeah, so sustainable CO2 is an absolutely integral part of our carbon management offering. So we don't just offer carbon capture, we really offer the whole carbon management solution. And sustainable CO2, it's a recycled, traceable product. You know exactly where it was and how it was delivered and where it was delivered. And there are a number of things that we can do with it. The very basic thing, and I think most people don't realize that when you're supplying CO2, even for things like a greenhouse or beverage product, it's a commingled product. It's a combination of virgin CO2, some recycled CO2 with no traceability, that is delivered over thousands of miles, unless you're next to an ethanol plant in the Midwest or in Texas. And so that is a problem for Scope 3 emissions for the buyers. So at the very least, we can deliver local, trackable, guaranteed recycled product, hence sustainable CO2. But we can go further with it than that. CO2 is now being used as a petroleum displacement product. So rather than we have plastic everywhere, unfortunately, in our lives. And to get rid of the plastic component is very difficult. But now there are technologies that allows you to, with blending with hydrogen, blending with other things, you can make petroleum-free plastic or kind of a plastic substitute product. You can also make sustainable jet fuel by using CO2. And so at least there, we're also delivering that petroleum displacement. And in some cases, that is not always true depending on geography, but you can permanently store CO2. You can permanently store it in concrete, which is what we're doing currently in New York, or you can put it underground where it turns into rock as well. So there are a number of options, and we match the client's needs, the geography, the market, to help them do that whole carbon management.
Thank you. Another thing I really wanted to touch on is carbon capture for data centers. As we know, data centers consume a lot of electricity and their energy consumption is only going to increase in the years to come. So I was wondering, how do you believe their operations can become more sustainable, and whether a CarbonQuest solution is compatible with the way data centers are powered?
Yeah, I've been really interested in the data center question for a while. And in my previous experiences, I worked quite a bit on data centers. And at the time, they really built a data center. They put some chillers in because you really need cooling for the data center, not heating. And that was that. But that industry, as you said, is really changing. And I think there are three things that are converging. One is they need resilient power, just like a hospital. Otherwise, all of a sudden, all our devices get interrupted. So they need constant resilient power, which means oftentimes they want it on site. Then they just simply need more power. That is the big conundrum for that industry. As digitalization grows, as AI grows, they need exponentially more power than data centers needed 15 years ago. So where do you get that power? Can the utility provide that or not? And the third thing is the power needs to be green. There's a lot of pressure on that sector to really deliver green, to use green power. But that's a very hard three-pronged challenge to solve. And so there's a lot of innovation in the space on how to deliver resilient on-site power that is also green. And for data centers, what's really important is the capacity factor of that power, meaning what percentage of time is the power system on. And that's why they need as close to 100% capacity factor as possible. But that means on-site renewables may not be the easiest option. And they buy green power and power purchase agreements, but you don't want to just keep doing that. You really want to do something on site as well. So what do? I don't think there is a silver bullet or that our solution solves all the problems, not in the least. But I do think that data centers that may want to purchase a fuel cell system or a CHP system, those have very high capacity factors, 95% and up. And then they bolt on the carbon capture, just like in a building, any other building. It's also a building, really. And you put in this carbon capture plus fuel cell or carbon capture plus CHP. And then you get that constant supply of power. We did not interrupt that in any way. And it is decarbonized because we will capture virtually all of the emissions from the data center. So we do think we can play very well in that space as these demands grow bigger and really change, I would say, dramatically from how things were 10 years ago.
Is there any specific project in mind that you are considering, or one that you can disclose at this point?
So we submitted actually an application for a program that a few big names in the data center world have put out recently. We don't know the results of that yet, but it was our first foray into the space where essentially data center users and owners were looking for innovative solutions, and carbon capture was part of their kind of proposed if somebody who had that solution, they could apply. They also were talking about hydrogen and some other things. And so we have proposed multiple fuel cell plus carbon capture sites in the power areas where they most need them. So in PGM and also in the Western electricity grid systems. And so we'll see how that goes. But beyond that, we think that's where we can really bring in value, and we'd love to have more conversations. We are just starting to have those conversations with the data center users.
Brilliant. Now, with that in mind, I kind of also wanted to take a step back and look at the bigger picture as far as building decarbonization goes. Specifically, what would you describe are the main challenges of this sector? And on a brighter note, how do you see the space developing in the years leading up to 2030 and then 2050, since those are the most important marks right now?
Yeah, I'm hoping that it's not too late. I think this is where all of us in this space are always worried, how fast can we go? And the biggest challenge to me is that when it has really become apparent to governments that and policymakers that this is climate crisis is an emergency, there was a bit of a rush into the idea that everything can be electrified and right now. And partially maybe that came from the previous effort around energy efficiency and energy management. And there you can universally apply energy conservation anywhere. And so to me, what I've seen happen is that electrify everything right now is proving to be a lot more difficult than doing energy conservation everywhere right now. And again, as I said, in new homes, makes perfect sense to electrify. Existing homes, I think, are next. Smaller buildings are next. But if bigger buildings, headquarters, campus settings, utility infrastructure, if those things were easy to electrify, data centers as well, then cities like New York would be electrifying a lot more buildings than they currently are. And I think that, and a lot more factories would be doing it. So we have to be realistic that one solution here is probably not the answer. And so to me, the challenge is around acceptance of more than one option, at least for the next 30 years, because we got to do something now. If we only say, well, electrification will get cheaper, it will get better, I'm sure it will, but what do we do in the meantime? And I think in the meantime, we do need these additional tools to help us decarbonize the economy quickly. And so to me, the challenge is to have that open mind, especially when it comes to policy. And I think then we can solve it. And we're one part of the solution. We're not the only part, but we really believe that carbon capture absolutely will play a role and is playing a role. And it can, and given it's really carbon capture 2.0 these days. It is not the same thing as when they did this at an oil refinery to pump more oil out of the ground. This is a whole new game here. And I do think we're a big part of the solution. And just looking forward to opening those minds more.
And since you mentioned policy, if I may, I'd like to get your take on the kind of political support that carbon capture has been getting, specifically from the United States government, which is, it's been gaining a lot of attention in the last couple of years, especially.
Yeah. So the U.S. government has provided tax incentives to a whole range of technologies. I think that was the right approach. Carbon capture is one of those. It's an incentive based on how many tons you've captured, and then you get a value. So for if you put that CO2 into petroleum displacement product like a jet fuel, you get $65 a ton. And if you sequester it, or $60 a ton, I apologize. And if you sequester it, you get $85 a ton. I think that's a great incentive that may in itself not be enough. In the sense that what we really also need to figure out is the transportation of CO2. How do we make this with least amount of emissions and in the kind of the most cost effective way possible. So I think there needs to be a little bit more policy work around transportation of CO2 and also speeding up the sequestration, putting it in the ground, and how does that become less expensive? And that goes for sequestration for CO2 from emitters and also from direct air capture.
And another question I have to ask, which is not policy related, but how scalable is CarbonQuest's solution?
Yeah, it is absolutely scalable. I mean, we are, I would say we're almost inundated with requests, and some of them we think, look, we'd love to work with you, but we're not ready. We also need to be strategic and focused. And so for us, we love that we get so many people calling us, and I would say 99.9% of organizations that call us have done their due diligence, have looked at other solutions, have looked at electrification, have looked at it very seriously with engineering firms, with studies, and have said, look, we don't know what else to do. And maybe carbon capture is a solution. And in some cases, it may not be, but in a lot of cases, it is. And so we really, we're just trying to sort through which markets we should be attacking next, if you will. So we're as I said, focused on CHP and fuel cells, but now we're also stepping into things like biogenic CO2, which is wastewater facilities. We just got a grant to do feasibility studies around a waste to energy plant. So nobody wants to live next to an incinerator, but they also provide power. So how do you decarbonize those? And you know, what else do you do with your trash? So there are, I think, all sorts of new and exciting markets, and also scaling within the markets that we're currently in.
Excellent. So perhaps before we wrap up the episode, I also wanted to see if you could offer us a sneak peek into more of what CarbonQuest has lined up for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've just signed a couple of partnerships, especially around the fuel cell area. But in 2024, I think it will be hugely exciting. It is already a very exciting year for us. I think we'll see more projects, different types of clients. You will see more around actual implementation with the fuel cells and CHP. I will also be stepping more into that biogenic CO2 capture. That's the waste to energy facilities, wastewater, things like that. And we will continuously develop more partnerships in the sustainable CO2 offtake and carbon management. We already have quite a few, and we're excited to keep adding more and more partners in all different types of CO2 sequestration and utilization. And I think the last thing you'll see is that we will be more widespread around the US, and there will be some projects in Canada most likely as well.
Just one last question, I promise. Since you mentioned these partnerships, are there any that you can speak to?
So we're currently in the mode of it's lovely to have a partnership. We want to talk about it when we are actually shovels in the ground. So even though we've signed a lot of MOUs, we're not quite ready to advertise them because we think the proof is in the pudding. Proof is in like, hey, we have a project. This is our sequestration or utilization partner. So we're not announcing them when we sign these agreements. We announce them when we actually have a project. So I think you will have to interview us again.
Okay. I will definitely look forward to having another chat with you like this, probably another 6 to 12 months down the line, and excited to learn what the company has going on then.
That's great.
Anna, thank you so much for sharing all the important work that CarbonQuest does and for shining a light on how crucial it is for us to start decarbonizing the buildings we work and live in. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Violet, for doing this and including us on your show. It's really great to have podcasters talk about it. So thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.